Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. 2018 was a year of diplomacy for the U.S. and North Korea, but there is little progress since the Singapore summit. Today we analyze why Washington and Pyongyang failed to make headway on denuclearization and building a new relationship.
미국 번터 전역이 우리의 핵 타격 사정권 안에 있으며 핵 단추가 내 사무실 책상 위에 항상 놓여 있다는 것.
An American president and a leader of North Korea proves that real change is indeed possible.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Thomas Countryman, Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Arms Control Association. Mr. Countryman was acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Also joining me today, Mr. David Maxwell, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Maxwell is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces Colonel with assignments in Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, at the Singapore summit, the U.S. and North Korea agreed to establish a new bilateral relationships. So ever since, has the relations improved?
It certainly is an improvement when the two leaders are talking to each other instead of exchanging very violent threats with each other. The big question for next year is whether you can build on that very important opening at the top and establish the kind of normal relationship that I think both countries ultimately want to have.
Do you see any improvement in relations?
Yes, well, certainly talking at the highest level is certainly an improvement and something that we haven't seen before. However, there have been no working level negotiations. I mean, it has been President Trump and Secretary Pompeo, and we have not seen negotiations between our special representative, Mr. Stephen Biegun, and the North Korean representative, Chae Sun-hee. And I think until those talks begin to take place, we're really not going to see any movement forward. But talking between leaders is a good thing, and that's a good start.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think we haven't seen a significant, dramatic improvement in relations? What was the problem?
There are multiple problems, but if you want to make one general observation, it would be that both President Trump and Mr. Kim have a record and a reputation for being tough negotiators, and they each have a record and a reputation for not keeping agreements that they have made. And as a consequence, any complex negotiation is going to be extremely long and difficult, and both sides are going to dig into maximum positions. Usually that leads to each side in a normal negotiation working on incremental steps, but we are not there yet in this negotiation.
Mm-hmm. The fundamental problem is that North Korea and the United States have two different views of these negotiations. North Korea wants to have first change in the relationship between the North and the U.S., second build trust, and then third dismantlement of the nuclear program. The United States, of course, wants first dismantlement, then build trust, then change the relationship. And so I think that's where we are, the two extreme positions. And so there's got to be a meeting in the middle somewhere.
Mm-hmm. So U.S. is continuing to reach out to North Korea, asking for meetings with North Korea. But why do you think North Korea is not moving?
Well, I'm not sure either side is moving off of their maximum demand and their requirement that the other side make major steps before our side does anything significant. That's the position both countries are in at the moment. Again, I think it's possible to break down the maximum U.S. demand, complete elimination of nuclear weapons, can break it down into steps, which are slow down, cap, and then reduce, and then eliminate. And if you were able to break it into those steps, you could break the North Korean demand into similar steps as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree that we should break it down, or should we get declaration list up front?
Well, I think that is really a very difficult position. First, though, let me say that I think that I worry that Kim Jong-un thinks that he can deal directly with President Trump. And I think that is also a complicating factor. And so I think with that, it prevents us from taking any of the normal negotiating processes that we might. And so I think that Kim Jong-un is focusing on improving relations with the South to better his position. And of course, the one thing that he really wants immediately is sanctions relief. And I think that that's really his most important immediate requirement is sanctions relief. And that is something that we are just not going to give in at this time.
Mm-hmm. So other elements of the Singapore summit were the 4-point agreement was the return of the POW remains and working towards denuclearization and the peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So what progress did we see on these 4 elements?
Well, we saw progress on the return of missing in action remains and prisoner of war remains of U.S. servicemen. That's positive. That's a goodwill gesture. It costs the North Korean regime nothing, but it is important to President Trump, and it is important to the American people as well. To get beyond that simple confidence-building measure into the kinds of steps that would lead to a real peace regime between the two countries, we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Maxwell, what do you think about North Korea's denuclearization steps this year?
Well, I don't think they've taken any substantive denuclearization steps. I think that the actions that they took at Pyongyang were purely symbolic. And of course, there have been no inspectors there, so we really don't know what the status is. They brought journalists in, they destroyed 2 of the opening tunnels, and that's really it. Sohae is a fixed-launched, liquid-fueled launch site. It is not critical to its nuclear program, and they partially dismantled that. Again, no inspectors, although we are able to observe with satellite imagery. So these steps have really not been substantive. I mean, the only important thing that has happened in the last year is they haven't conducted a nuclear or missile test. But we should remember that on January 1st last year, Kim Jong-un said he'd completed his nuclear deterrent and they were ready for mass production. And I think that really is something that too often we forget. And we, of course, will be watching and listening to his upcoming New Year's Day speech because he will tell us what he's going to do in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it a little differently. I think the steps are more than symbolic, but they are definitely reversible, and they do not yet warrant the lifting of sanctions by the United States or the United Nations. Key steps that I expect that the U.S. negotiators are seeking now is a cessation and dismantlement of activity at Yongbyon, and as Mr. Maxwell said, the inclusion of international inspection regimes.
Mm-hmm. So throughout the year, there were revelations of North Korea's secret facilities, secret uranium and missile facilities. And how does this go against the spirit of the Singapore summit?
Well, I don't think Kim Jong-un follows the spirit of anything. I think they interpret it literally. But again, I think that these revelations, are indications that North Korea continues to develop its nuclear and missile programs. And I think that, from North Korea's perspective, since they have not gotten concessions, since they still perceive a threat, that they want to maintain their deterrent capability. And again, he said that they were going to begin mass production. So it really should be no surprise that they are continuing to do this. And these really aren't revelations, but it comes really from the nature of the Kim family regime, how they think and how they operate.
Ever since the Singapore summit, Russia, China, and South Korea has been asking for easing of the sanctions. What do you think is that? Let's start with China.
Well, China and Russia are similar in that both of them view the North Korean problem not as a discrete problem on their border, but as a subset of their broader relationship with the United States. And both Beijing and Moscow want to maximize the value of this dispute in order to increase their leverage vis-a-vis Washington. And so it suits especially China very well to call for the easing of sanctions. It's both a benefit to their own economic interests, but it also strengthens North Korea's hands in the negotiation with Washington, and that is to China's advantage. Russia, I do not see as a significant player in the dispute between North Korea and the world, but they can play a significant spoiling role. And calling for sanctions is part of the constant effort by Russia to reassert its importance as a superpower.
Mm-hmm. And looking back at the year 2018, do you think we can expect China to cooperate on the North Korea issue in the future?
I don't think it will cooperate in the way that necessarily that we would like. I think that to add on to what Mr. Countryman said, I think China wants lifting of sanctions to ensure stability in North Korea. I think that's one of the key factors. They don't want war and conflict, and they don't want an unstable North Korea. So I think that they see lifting of sanctions to help maintain that stability. So I don't think that they will push for denuclearization in a way that we would like. And I think that they also believe that they've accomplished their recommendation, which was a freeze for a freeze. Freezing of the North Korean program for freeze of the exercises. They proposed this over a year ago, and now it's come to fruition. So I think from their perspective, they think that they've been cooperating and have achieved objectives on the Korean Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. So is President Trump on track to succeed where others have failed in denuclearizing North Korea?
I think that the president is very simplistic when he says that diplomacy has never achieved anything with North Korea. At several times in the past, negotiations succeeded in slowing down and even halting North Korea's progress. But he's correct that it has never fixed the problem. I think that the opening he gave, which I support, direct high summit-level talks with the North Korean leader, gives us the possibility. What I'm concerned about is that President Trump will not devote the time necessary to really study and master these issues and keep a focus on it. He doesn't seem capable of that kind of focus.
I don't think anyone is capable of really denuclearizing North Korea except for Kim Jong-un. He's got to make that choice. And as the administration says over and over again, and you hear this from Mr. Began, it's up to Kim Jong-un to make the right strategic choice. And if he does, the United States supports a brighter future for North Korea. And I think that really is the essence of it. And I think that is the success so far, that we have had high-level talks and multiple high-level talks. And I think that is the difference, between 1994, 2005, 2007, 2012. The high-level talks are taking place. There is potential, but it's really up to Kim Jong-un to make that right strategic choice. If he doesn't make the right choice, then his people, the Korean people living in the north, are going to continue to suffer under the despotic regime that exists now.
So let's expect Kim Jong-un to make that strategic choice next year and move on to our next segment.
한반도의 비핵화와 항구적인 평화 체제를 위한 우리의 여정은 결코 중단될 수 없다는 점을 확인하고
that we don't talk past each other, that we don't take an action or the South Koreans don't take an action that the other is unaware of or hasn't had a chance to comment on.
The U.S.-South Korea alliance had its ups and downs this year. South Korea's rush to engage North Korea strained the alliance. In 2018, when did U.S.-RK relations reach the lowest point, do you think?
Well, I would say they've reached the lowest point just in the last week with statements by President Trump that call into question the value of alliances that we have not only in Asia with the Republic of Korea and Japan, but also with allies in Europe and elsewhere. When he refers to the U.S. having been suckers for engaging in alliances, I think that has to send a very negative message, not just to the South Korean government, but to the South Korean people as well.
Mr. Maxwell, when do you think was the lowest point?
Well, I think Mr. Countryman makes an excellent point, and I think we should discuss that. But I think that it's after the September 19th Pyongyang Declaration, and I think that the comprehensive military agreement between North and South, I think at that point relations were somewhat strained because agreements were made between North and South that have military impact, alliance military impact, and there was not sufficient consultation prior to those agreements being made. So I think that was probably, if not the low point, it was probably the second low point.
Well, I guess as Mr. Countryman mentioned, the message from Washington regarding the burden sharing could be one of the factors. What could be other factors that drove a wedge between the two countries?
Well, I think that it was the apparent lack of coordination and communication. The movement of South Korea to engage rapidly with the North. But I do think that has been mitigated as the State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have established a strategic level working group to coordinate policy and strategy toward North Korea. And I think that since they established that in October, there has been very good coordination between both departments. And I think that that's a very positive way forward.
Keep in mind that Pyongyang always seeks to drive a wedge between Washington and Seoul. They see it not only as essential to the bigger goal that they are seeking, a regular relationship with the United States, but they also see it as a good alternative. If they don't get anywhere with the U.S., weakening the U.S.-ROK relationship is valuable to Pyongyang. Despite that, I continue to have a lot of admiration for how President Moon has handled the diplomacy both with the North and with the United States. And I continue to be optimistic that he will prevent a very deep fissure from opening up between these two important allies.
On the other hand, some people say that President Moon's initiatives actually raise concerns of pacing in Washington.
Yes, I think that has raised concern, but I think that as we have seen in the last 2 months since this working group has been established, there has been very good coordination, and I think that really the pacing now has to come from North Korea, from Pyongyang. They are the ones that are not coming forward to negotiate, and I think that the ROK and the U.S. are in a not lockstep per se, but are moving forward together.
So, Mr. Countryman, after the working group was established, the U.S. is now more open to support South Korea's initiatives regarding North Korea. Other than the fact that they are more coordinating right now, is this more to give an incentive to North Korea to come back to the talks?
I'm not sure the exact reasons that the State Department would give, but I think it is a smart policy for the U.S. and ROK to coordinate very carefully and to give exceptions to sanctions regulations that advance humanitarian goals, for example. That both is consistent with longstanding U.S. policy, it is important to the feelings of South Korean citizens, and it provides a signal and an incentive to the North Korean regime.
Reportedly, President Trump has been considering reducing U.S. troops from South Korea. So does the Trump administration consider withdrawing U.S. troops from South Korea as their last resort?
We really need to ask ourselves, do we have an alliance with Korea that is based on shared values, as it always has, shared strategy, and shared interests, or is our alliance merely transactional? I think that's the fundamental question that we have to ask about the alliances. And of course, I believe we have shared values, that we believe in freedom, individual liberty, liberal democracy, free market economy, and human rights. Those are our shared values. The shared strategy toward North Korea and our shared interests, we want peace on the peninsula. I think that that's what should drive our alliance.
I agree that's what should happen. What concerns me is that President Trump may make a decision on withdrawing U.S. troops from South Korea, not based on the state of negotiations with North Korea, not based upon the shared values, not based upon the advice of his own foreign policy leaders, but based solely on what he calls his gut and the demonstrated hostility he has towards any of our alliances. That's not only bad for South Korea, but would be a strategic blunder for the United States to withdraw those troops at this time.
And relatedly, U.S. and South Korea has stopped military exercises one after another. Some say, considering the turnover of the U.S. soldiers in South Korea, the longest you can do is 1 year without hurting the military readiness on South Korea. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, first of all, the military leaders in South Korea and the United States know that the military exists to support the political objectives. And so while they would recommend against reducing readiness capabilities in any circumstance, they know that it's most important to support the political objectives. And so what the commanders are doing is they are ensuring readiness at all levels, tactical, operational, and strategic. The exercises really hurt our strategic readiness. Our senior leaders, senior staffers of the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, which is charged with the defense of the Republic of Korea, the turnover every year requires that exercises be conducted. And that's why we have All-Chief Freedom Guardian, Key Resolve, Full Eagle. But commanders are now taking steps to ensure readiness in other ways, to mitigate the risk that is caused by this, while still continuing to support the political object. So readiness does decline somewhat, but commanders are creative and know how to mitigate these risks, and they are doing so.
And last question, other than the working group, what can the U.S. and South Korea do going into 2019 to improve the bilateral alliance and relationship?
Well, from the United States side, the most valuable thing would be to have the president, number one, keep agreements that the United States has made, and number two, speak about allies as a positive force for the United States as part of our security. I don't know if the president will begin to do that. I don't know if we'll get a Secretary of Defense who will try to do that the way that Secretary Mattis tried to do it. But that would be central in my mind. From the ROK side, it's consult, consult, consult. It has to be, before the ROK does anything with the DPRK, there is going to be no surprises in Washington about what President Moon's team is doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll leave it here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture from this week's groundbreaking ceremony for Inter-Korean Railway project at the North Korean city of Daeseong. What was absent from the ceremony was actual breaking of the ground. There isn't a blueprint for the project yet. David, what's your reaction?
Well, the sign certainly looks wonderful, and I hope someday that they are able to connect the train. I had wondered if Kim Jong-un would have showed up with his armored train ready to ride south, and perhaps with President Moon aboard. But I think they're not at that point yet. So I think that this is a great first step towards improving relations between North and South, but there's still a long way to go.
Tom?
It's a symbol, it's a hope, it's a dream. I wish that it would be an inspiration to negotiators, especially in the North, to try to move forward on reducing security risks so that this kind of economic and personal benefit can flow to all the citizens of North and South.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Maxwell, Mr. Countryman,
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
This was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us in the new year for more analysis on North Korea.